This is part 2 of the 3 basic problems in the Philippines video series. Imperialism, which is the highest stage of capitalist development, takes shape when a handful of monopoly capitalists have complete control over the world's markets, resources, and labor. Imperialists exert control over neo-colonies through direct and indirect means to secure super profits and monopolies. Such methods include politically destabilizing a region, military occupation, or destroying local and national economies. But why did the United States colonize the Philippines in the first place? With an abundance of natural resources, the Philippines was colonized for American profits under the guise of civilizing and educating the backward Filipino. The U.S. maintained their colonial grip by crushing sentiments of national sovereignty and by erasing Philippine history from public schools while emphasizing American culture and ideals. Yet, even after having declared formal independence over 70 years ago, the Philippines still remains under direct control of the U.S. As a result of this de facto rule, many of our kababayan here and at home continue to suffer in desolate conditions. From an economic standpoint, the United States continues to exert control over the Philippines through lending via the IMF and the World Bank. Although the loans from IMF and World Bank are intended to promote economic growth for borrowing countries, the terms and conditions of these financial agreements, often called for structural adjustments, that work in the benefit of lending countries, putting borrowing countries in an even more economically disadvantaged position. In the case of the United States and the Philippines, the high interest rates of these loans force the Philippines to agree to terms that drive the country further into cycles of debt, keeping them dependent on the United States financially. To secure profits and capitalist interests made through the IMF and World Bank, it became necessary for the American military to intervene and occupy the Philippines through permanent military bases and stationed soldiers. Tying military occupation to lending requirements ensures that the Philippines remains in the hands of the American government. Additionally, the Philippine government's ties to U.S. capitalist interests have only deepened since Duterte's inauguration. In April of last year, the two governments ratified an arms deal that will provide Philippine military and police weapons of mass destruction. Instead of protecting the Filipino people, these weapons have been used against them, further inflicting fear and terror on the masses. Along with military sales, the Visiting Forces Agreement has deepened U.S. presence in the Philippines. This agreement allows U.S. troops to be present on Philippine soil for activities that are approved by the government. It also grants American soldiers and U.S. civil employees special rights and privileges, such as being held in U.S. custody while being tried for crimes committed in the Philippines. From these examples of U.S. imperialism, we see how monopoly capitalists and their collaborators in governments and militaries are at direct opposition to the will of the Filipino people. Although the United States does not directly occupy Philippine territory, we see how its imperialist tactics do not work in the interests of the Filipino people. We call for the passage of the Philippine Human Rights Act, which aims to minimize Philippine human rights violations through the suspension of military aid funded by our U.S. tax dollars. We call for $500 million of our tax dollars to be redirected in funding student education and COVID economic relief here in the U.S. While legislation is one way to effect change, it isn't the only way. Anti-imperialist organizations like Untitled in Los Angeles have been at the forefront of this struggle for over 2 decades. The shift from a Republican to a Democrat White House does not symbolize progress, but is simply U.S. imperialism changing its face. U.S. imperialism will remain in the Philippines regardless of the party in power.